For those of you I don't know, I'm Andy Reid, and I'm director of the Duke Marine Lab, and I am thrilled to be here to see so many familiar faces, former students, current staff member, Jody, up in the top there, our librarian of the Duke Marine Lab. I get to introduce today's panel, which is focusing on our oceans and coastal communities and the work that we do. If you were here for the last set of presentations, Joel talked about the superpowers that he got while he was at Duke. And the folks on the panel here today are some of the people who enable the acquisition of those superpowers. And it's just an enormous pleasure to be working at an institution where that engagement and that learning occurs. And especially to be at the Marine Lab in Beaufort, which as President Price likes to say is one of Duke's crown jewels. If you haven't been to the Marine Lab and you're a Duke alum, and I've met several of you tonight who have not been, please contact me, come down for a visit, we'll show you around. It's a wonderful place. It's a place where students who come often tell us it's the most formative part of their experience at Duke. But anyway, so I am going to just allow our faculty members to introduce themselves, and we'll start with just a quick round of introductions, and then we'll talk about some of the ways that we're engaging with our research and our scholarship and our practice in making the world a better place. And we think about doing this, especially today, thinking about focusing on solutions. We try and remind ourselves to spend 80% of our time thinking about solutions and only 20% of our time documenting problems. So I'm going to start with Juliet.
I'm Juliet Wong. I'm an assistant for several different levels of biological organization, from looking down at the molecular level and how these organisms are responding to climate change, things like how the role that genetics play, how different genes are expressed. I look at the level of the whole organism, so I look at things like physiology and sometimes behavior. I also look at the population level and how different populations can respond to climate change stress in different ways from one another. And lastly, I look at organisms within the context of their whole ecosystems and how organisms and their environments are interacting with one another. My work overall, it really focuses on two goals, two aims. One is that through this work, it allows us to understand how is it organisms are responding to climate change currently, as well as make better predictions for how these organisms are going to respond to climate change in the future as conditions continue to change. This is really important. It helps us identify which species or populations or areas are more vulnerable to climate change, as well as the ones that are more resilient, because this is really important for decision-making processes. And this kind of feeds into the second goal, which is guiding and better informing conservation, restoration, and aquaculture activities. And so a lot of this work goes towards testing solutions and ideally limiting losses and improving climate resilience in the face of climate change.
So I am one of the social scientists at the lab. I've been at the lab for 20 years, and I study governance processes, and by governance I mean both formal government, but also the role of non-state actors, civil society, scientific collaborations in shaping how we think and use coastal resources, and how the projects that we design to try and address some of the problems we have in the coastal environment impact on local communities. It's way more than I intended to say for my introduction, so I'll just ad-lib a little and say that I'm also one of several Canadians at the lab. My favorite color is blue, and I am really realizing tonight that all my dreams of having a talk show are gone because I'm blinded by this light. But I will hand it over to Steve to do his introduction. What were you planning on? Tap dancing?
He's going to sing.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you so much. And thank you for that wonderful introduction, Dr. Reid, from my late interest. I'm Steve Roady. I've spent my career basically trying to protect the environment using the laws. We have some really strong federal laws in this country, thank you very much, and state laws as well. But my work has been in the federal arena, I got asked to come to Duke about 8 years ago to teach full-time, and I really am very lucky at Duke because what I get to do is work with not only young law students, but also with environment school students and PhD students who are more into policy. And so I teach a couple of classes that are cross-listed with both law students and Nicholas School students. And what we try to do in those classes, getting back to Andy's point, we try to focus on using the laws and policies in this country to solve some of these really difficult ocean and coastal problems, including problems that are directly related to climate change, like sea level rise, like losing our coral reefs. By virtue of the fact we're at the law school, we're able to file sometimes briefs in various federal court actions. One recent case went to the Supreme Court. It had to do with pollution of a reef near Lahaina in Maui. We were able to help win that case, which was a good thing for the environment. And I feel very fortunate to be here tonight. Thank you all for coming out, and I'll turn it back over to Andy.
Thanks, everybody. I just want to remark, this is such a Duke panel, right? It's like, it's so multidisciplinary. It cuts across disciplinary boundaries. We've got a natural scientist, a social scientist, and a legal scholar. And I just think that's part of Duke's DNA to work across those disciplinary boundaries, which is critical when we're facing the issues that we are facing in terms of environmental degradation, in terms of climate change. We need folks who can work across those boundaries. So I'm going to let each of the speakers now talk a little bit about the work they're doing, and then we will kind of riff off each other's comments a little bit at the end. So Juliet, off you go.
Okay, so I would like to start by sharing a little bit about a Bass Connections team that I'm leading. So for some background, Bass Connections is a Duke program. It allows faculty to collaborate with one another and form a team of Duke students, primarily undergraduates and master's students, to work on a particular project together. So this allows us to form teams of students that are coming in across a bunch of different majors. They're at different stages of their academic career. They come with their own backgrounds and experiences and interests and their own diverse perspectives. And throughout the course of a year, they work directly with faculty conducting research. So Bass Connections really sort of blurs the divide between the classroom and research. And it lets students work with faculty and get research experience, as well as develop their science communication skills. So my Bass Connections team is focused on exploring climate change impacts on oysters and oyster farms. So we are examining how different environmental conditions on oyster farms are impacting oyster performance, and how this can vary with different genetic family lines of oysters, as well as different farming practices. And the goal of this is for us to then be able to share that useful information with oyster farmers. And part of this leverages a very unique and personally, I think, wonderful resource at the Duke Marine Lab, which is we have our very own oyster farm, the Duke Aqua Farm. It's about a 20-minute boat ride from campus. So what this means is that not only am I able to pretty readily go out and conduct research, but we can really immerse students within that experience. They can really join in on part of the process. So we get students on the boat, they get out in the water, they're taking measurements, they're collecting samples, they bring oysters back to the lab, they run experiments, and it helps support them through their own independent research projects. Another Duke initiative that I'd like to quickly touch upon is Duke Restore. This is focused on rebuilding ecosystems with the purpose of improving nature and people through innovative restoration research. So this is also something that's actually quite student-driven, where primarily master's students will form restoration teams. So for example, there's a seagrass restoration team. Seagrass is extremely important both as a habitat as well as providing coastal resilience it sequesters carbon, and this team is working to create a seagrass farm and developing ways of collecting seagrass seeds and planting them. There's another Duke Restore team focused on living shorelines that's working with the US Marine Corps. So this is an initiative that puts together students with industry partners, which really increases the capacity and helps support infrastructure for students to be able to do restoration work at scale, while simultaneously Duke is providing monitoring as well as the research, right? They're driving forward innovative and new techniques and technologies related to restoration work.
So I have been spending a lot of time over the past 10 years thinking about very large-scale political processes that are really reimagining how we think about and how we govern oceans, both for resource extraction and for conservation. So I'm talking about processes in the UNFCCC, the Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, the ISA, the International Seabed Authority. Basically, I don't, Steve might agree with me that this moment in the ocean's history from a policy perspective is pretty significant. Now my notes went away. But my roots as a researcher are really in connecting these type of global processes and the policy and management interventions that emerge from them to local places and the people who live in those places and the people who are impacted by those policies. So for example, when the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change agrees that mangroves can count as forests, this has implications for counting mangroves towards carbon sequestration. And it changes, for example, the national government's interest in those spaces as places where they can meet their Paris commitments. So what happens, another example, when the global governments agree that we will protect 30% of our oceans in marine protected areas by 2030, that's not very far away, and we have about 10% protected right now. So what's going to happen in those places where MPAs are put in place? How will people's livelihoods be impacted? And how can we work to ensure that communities in the front line of those initiatives reap some of the benefits from them rather than bearing the costs of global priorities? So I've asked these types of questions in a number of places, in Costa Rica, in the Caribbean, and through my students through really lovely places in the Pacific and some Pacific Island communities. But I've also worked locally in Carteret County, where the Marine Lab is based, and I want to talk a little bit about that work now. So I collaborate with a number of partners in the community to think about how communities are responding to environmental change. And I just want to be clear that for communities, it's not just environmental change, right? It's the social, economic, and political change that comes with that environmental change. We've done this in fairly broad ways, but also looked at things like how do communities draw on social capital and social networks to respond to things like Hurricane Florence and other storms that come through the area. So increasingly, I work, and many social scientists work, in what I would call a participatory or a collaborative or a co-production framework. And this type of research is responsive to long-standing concerns about really extractive forms of research, where researchers go in and take a lot of data without a lot of concern about how their research and the results will impact those communities. But there's also a pragmatic reason, not just an ethical one, to engage with communities, and that is when research is co-produced through community partnerships, when it resonates with community concerns, it's more likely to be meaningful, and I would argue the results are much more likely to resonate, to be trusted, and to be potentially to influence action. It's not always guaranteed, but it's a solid footing to start out on. So sustaining those types of community relationships and partnerships through the individual grant model of research is really hard. You have a 3-year project with support for community engagement, and then that project is over. So the last part of my comments, I want to talk about the way the Marine Lab has invested in building infrastructure to make community partnerships more sustainable and more meaningful. And that, there's a number of different ways, but I'm going to focus on the Community Science Initiative. And this is a program, not a project, that directors at the Marine Lab, and especially Andy, have invested in that connects research done at the lab to the community. So the Community Science Initiative is led by my colleague Liz DiMattia, who's not here tonight. But what she does is she takes like a local issue that we have research ongoing with. So for example, water quality or plastic pollution. And then she works with school teachers, with the Boys and Girls Clubs, with other community partners to get the research we're doing into the classrooms through curriculum and make sure that curriculum meets North Carolina standards, et cetera. She does things like collaborates with the high school art club to get the art club out and painting storm drains in the community to help tell the story of runoff and how runoff in the community ends up in the oceans. So part of the job of community science is really translating science to the communities, embedding it in those communities in a way that it's meaningful to them. But it also brings people to the lab, the public in general, but specifically K through 12 age students in our local schools. And many of those students are from underserved communities. And whether they come to the lab for a day on a school trip, they participate in summer camp, they're in the STEM Pathways program, they're in the Boys and Girls Club, they're participating in the mentoring program. There are lots and lots of ways that they can get to the lab. They come in and they learn, sure, they learn about marine science, but they're also exposed to the possibility that there might be a career for them in that field. So I think it's easy to say that this kind of work is service, right? It's just the modern university being a good citizen. But I want to argue that it's actually really fundamental to the kind of research we're going to need to do in the face of climate change moving forward. So Juliet set me up for restoration, and our colleague Brian Silliman with Duke Restore was supposed to be here tonight and couldn't make it. But restoration, for example, is now a global project. The UNFCCC says that restoration could account for 30% of the carbon sequestration needed to reduce or to meet our climate commitments. Coastal restoration in places like Carteret County could have huge benefits, right? There could be benefits for habitat, for valued fish species. There's obviously co-benefits for things like protecting shorelines from erosion and serving in coastal protection in the face of storms. But if we're going to have large-scale coastal restoration succeed, we're going to have to partner with communities to integrate their knowledge, to recognize and account for their needs. Large-scale, I'll stop reading. Coastal restoration is not just a scientific or a technical project, right? It's a social and it's a political project. And the investments that the Marine Lab and Duke have made in things like the Community Science Initiative means that those relationships exist. There's trust, and we already have a foundation on which we can build rather than starting from scratch. So these kinds of partnerships, I argue, are really going to be critical in the face of the changes that places like Carteret County are going to experience. And they're necessary to ensuring that the interventions in coastal restoration that we come up with are both environmentally and socially sustainable.
Thank you, Lisa. So, as you all know, most, if not all, the students that come to us at Duke are destined to do really, really impactful things. And I see my job in my classes as being somebody who helps them understand what the tools are they might have to shape policies and laws in a positive, pro-environment direction. And it's becoming more and more important to do that as the climate changes and as these challenges become more and more difficult. So what we do in my work is we start off by introducing students to a lot of things they might not know. For example, there are probably 4 or 5 major federal environmental statutes that really can affect how people proceed with projects that might or might not adversely affect the environment. These include the National Environmental Policy Act, the Endangered Species Act, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, the Clean Water Act, and so on. So part of what we do is we just sort of introduce them to these statutes. We help them become familiar with the statutes. And then, as part of the work in the course, we ask them to work on designing ways to use those statutes in creative and constructive ways. And we actually ask them to write little 2-page decision memos for policymakers who may be wrestling with a difficult issue. And they're trying to figure out, how can we use the Clean Water Act, for example, to protect Chesapeake Bay? How can we use the Clean Water Act to protect wetlands? We work a lot through case studies. One of my favorite cases is one involving the little parrotfish down in the Caribbean. And as you may or may not know, parrotfish helps protect the reefs because the parrotfish grazes the algae off the reefs. In fact, parrotfishes help build beaches too, but I won't go into those details for you. But in any event, what happened in this particular case was the federal government was allowing the fishermen to suck all the parrotfish off the reefs in the Caribbean, overfish them, which was in violation of a federal statute, the Magnuson-Stevens Act. But most importantly, by doing that, it was going to be adversely affecting two species of corals, the elkhorn and the staghorn, not to be confused with the foghorn and the leghorn, which is a different species, Andy. And that was a violation of the Endangered Species Act. And that was our hook. That was our legal theory in the case. We took the case to court. We actually got the government to do a better job protecting the parrotfish. That's an example of the kind of thing we try to teach the students about in our classes and hopefully launch them off into the world to do great things.
Getting a taste of what it's like to take classes with all of us up here. Steve often breaks into song in his class, which is revered, I think. So he hasn't done that yet, but the night's not over. So one of the other things that strikes me about what our panelists just talked about is this movement between the hyper-local and the global, right? So I think about the oyster farm, which is our oyster farm in Carteret County, and we love it, and our students love working on it. And then Juliet takes those lessons and takes them out into the world at a scale. She works in Puerto Rico, other places. Think about Lisa's work. She talked about working in Carteret County, but she also works at this global scale. Steve and I had a Basque Connections project in which we were looking at one facet of the Marine Mammal Protection Act that requires countries who want to export fisheries products to the United States to meet the protective measures that help to reduce the bycatch of marine mammals in their fisheries, that they must meet the standards that U.S. fishermen have to meet. So I just want to, I guess, maybe start by talking about that like hyper-local to global and how you guys see that. It's impossible to work in an ocean environment without thinking, I think, at both of those scales. I'm going to start with you.
Okay. Yeah. Well, first off, I do want to highlight the importance of working locally, right? We are part of the communities in which we're living and what we're working and that we're studying. We really want to make sure that our communities know that we're part of them and that our work is going to directly contribute to, the same things that they're worried about, we're worried about too. The same kind of solutions that they want to find, we want to find too. But it's important to remember that what we experience locally isn't isolated to just where we are, right? What our local communities are experiencing, many communities are experiencing globally. So when we address our concerns, when we look for solutions for ourselves, we're doing it for many other communities as well who are facing very similar problems. Climate change, of course, it's global. It's affecting many different ecosystems. So it's also important to study different ecosystems, right? So, of course, especially with our students, we're able to take them into our local North Carolina ecosystems, but climate change is impacting coral reefs. Many people rely on coral reefs. Climate change is impacting polar ecosystems. In fact, it's disproportionately affecting polar ecosystems. They're warming at faster rates than other areas of the world. And so it's very important for us to study how climate change is impacting these different ecosystems, because people rely on all marine ecosystems, regardless of how close they actually live to them.
No, I mean, I think I'm really interested in questions of scale and environmental problems generally. But I was just thinking about, there's many people at the lab that are currently interested in aquaculture. And with my colleague, Grant Murray, we have a project. And one of the things that's really interesting about when a state decides they want to expand aquaculture is how optimistic everybody is. And it's like you can get the reporting the consultants report from any state in the US, from the west coast of Canada, and everyone says it's going to generate $3 billion in the first 10 years. There's actually numbers that we just see coming up over and over again. And what's interesting to me about that is that it imagines a certain scale of aquaculture, like large-scale aquaculture. And the aquaculture that we have, inshore oyster aquaculture in North Carolina, is not large scale. It's small scale, it's family owned. It's often from fishing families that have moved out of declining fisheries and are now in aquaculture. It's just really weird because I keep looking around the audience and I keep spotting new people that I know. So I'm sort of trying to keep my train of thought. But that sort of how, and then you read about the climate resilience of aquaculture and it's like, oh, well, we'll be able to move those cages of oysters. But that kind of ignores the fact that not everyone is mobile, right? We don't have access to all kinds of waters. And so the scale question of what a policy is designed for and who can thrive within that policy, I think is a really important question. And being at the place at the Marine Lab where there are people actually studying, you know, what is the big die-off and what's causing it with this industry that's supposed to save us from declining fisheries, and now we have die-off in oyster cages. I'm not being positive, I'm supposed to be more positive. But the positive part is working in a place where we have people to speak to all parts of those questions.
We have about 5 minutes left. So that's about 1.5 minutes for each of you to sum up. So rather than direct it, I'm going to let you guys choose where you want to go for this last little bit. I'm going to start with Councillor Roady at the far end.
Thank you so much, Professor Reed. So I want to introduce an entirely new topic here. Deep seabed mining. Nobody thinks much about this. It's out of sight, it's out of mind. It's coming soon to a theater near you. The theory is this. If we're going to do a green transition, we're going to need all sorts of batteries. And if we're going to do batteries, maybe we need a lot more cobalt and nickel and other things. And there are some high concentrations of these ores in the bottom of the sea. And some companies want to go out and start mining the bottom of the sea. And the problem is that we know less about the bottom of the sea than we do about the surface of the moon. We may have mapped maybe a fourth of the deep sea to any level of degree of certainty. So a lot of environmental people, and I'm working with them, are trying to get the International Seabed Authority to take a little time to do some regulation so we get some baseline data together before we jump into this particular adventure and to look for other options. And that's the kind of thing that we work with students on, and we talk about potential ways to get at these really gnarly, if I can use a technical legal term, really gnarly international negotiations. That's just one little sidelight we get.
Okay, I have to riff on seabed mining. I'm just going to say again, just to show the connections that we can make, that of course our recently retired former director, Cindy Van Dover, was an amazing deep sea scientist, is an amazing deep sea scientist. But of course it was a seabed where the UN originally articulated a concept of the common heritage principle. And one of the really interesting parts of the negotiations of the seabed is trying to, if we're going to mine the seabed with environmental considerations, we also have to think about the social considerations. And so there's equally a lot of people working to try and ensure that it's not just 5 or 6 companies, not even countries, right? 5 or 6 companies that benefit exclusively from minerals of the seabed. So that's another great way to think about the way the seabed is being reimagined and regoverned.
I'm not going to talk about the seabed. I am. I'm going to talk about, let's see, actually somebody tonight who came up to my table, I don't know if you're in the room, but asked me kind of one of the more interesting or unexpected things that I've found. And this is something that I deem to be a little bit more positive in the context of climate change. And that is some work I did. It's called transgenerational plasticity. This is where what we see is the parental generation, so what the parents experience, the mothers and the fathers experience, the environments that they experience will influence how well their progeny, their offspring, will do when they are exposed to stressful conditions. So I've seen this, for example, in sea urchins, where if their parents experienced stressful conditions, their offspring were better able to handle those same stressful conditions. And this is really important, this is interesting, this is actually independent of genetics, and it's a mechanism by which organisms are able to more rapidly adjust to climate change and potentially keep pace with how quickly their environments are changing. So this is quite optimistic. And in fact, we can actually leverage this. So I've done some work in New Zealand with some aquaculture scientists where we conditioned the adult broodstock under different temperature conditions, where we were testing what conditions we needed to hold them at before we did spawning and raised their offspring in a way that increased how heat tolerant their offspring were. And this was something that we could implement at a hatchery setting, where you can actually take mothers and fathers and control what conditions they experience. This is slightly harder to do in nature, but as we think about things like aquaculture, as we think about things like restoration, this is not new. This is something that's also being incorporated into things like coral restoration, where we do things like stress hardening, where you expose coral or whatever organism it is you're using to try and restore an ecosystem to stressful conditions. Not stressful enough to kill them, but stressful enough so you're essentially priming their response to that stress. And then the next time they see that stress in nature, they're better able to respond to it. And so I just sort of wanted to end on kind of an optimistic note about ways in which we can help animals keep pace with climate change.
Thank you. And I'm going to double down on that optimistic note. One of the things that happened that was remarkably wonderful at the beginning of this last academic year is that one of the professors in the Nicholas School, Joel Meyer, sent out an email to his faculty colleagues and said, I promised to talk to the incoming MEM students, and I'm going to tell them about, I want examples of environmental success stories to tell them. And you know what, like, email threads can be like at work, right? Awful. This was the most positive, uplifting thread of email stories in which every faculty member in the school was like, that's a good story, that's a great success story, but let me give you one that's even better. And there was this cascade of good news, of the things that people have done to make the environment better, to address climate in positive ways that have beneficial outcomes for people. And it just gave me enormous hope. And that, plus the students here who have graduated from our programs, are the two things that really give me great hope for the future. So I want to thank the panel. I want to thank all of you for coming tonight. We'll be outside, happy to chat with you before Vice Provost Steelman gives her remarks to close the evening. But thank you all for coming, and please continue to engage with Duke as we go forward. Thank you very much.